Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, after part 2 of season 2 ended up getting leaked on Peacock, we are finally here with the proper release of part 2 of season 2 of Dragons Rising. It is finally here, and in today's video, I am going to discuss my thoughts on it. And in case it isn't obvious by the title and thumbnail of the video, personally, I didn't really like part 2 of season 2. In my opinion, part 2 honestly felt pretty underwhelming, and to be completely and totally honest with you guys, I'd even go so far as to say that when it comes to part 2 of season 2 of Dragons Rising, this was a bad chapter of Dragons Rising, and I honestly think it is the weakest chapter of Dragons Rising that we've gotten so far. And in today's video, I'm going to discuss my thoughts on it. So just keep in mind this video will contain spoilers for part 2 of season 2 of Dragons Rising, and with all that out of the way, let's get into this whole thing. So when it comes to the style of review for this video, I'm going to be doing it the exact same way that I did my video talking about part 1 of season 2, where I'm just going to be talking about stuff in general when it comes to the season, share my thoughts on it, and I'm not going to be going over the stuff that I like and then the stuff that I don't like. And the reason why I did that is because I tried to do that in the style of my usual reviews. However, it ultimately didn't really work out because, for one, I just had a lot of negative stuff to say about part 2. But also, even when it came to the positive stuff that I had to say about part 2, in just about every instance, I had something negative to say. So the whole idea ultimately didn't work. So I'm going to be doing this in the style of my part 1 review. Also, in case you're wondering why I'm just doing a review of part 2 and why I'm not doing a review of season 2 in general right now, I'm probably going to do a full review of season 2 at some point in the future, but right now I just want to make a video discussing part 2 specifically because I already have a lot of things to say when it comes to part 2 in general, and I haven't really figured out what I'm going to say when it comes to both parts all together for a video. Again, I'll probably make a video discussing season 2 in general at some point in the future, but for now, I'm just going to be taking a look at part 2. And so with all that out of the way, let's now officially get into part 2, and I'm going to discuss my thoughts on it. So for starters, let's begin by discussing the ninja, and overall, I'm pretty mixed on how the ninja were handled during part 2, because I feel like there were some members of the team who were handled pretty well during part 2, and then there were some members who I think weren't really handled the best during part 2. So for starters, let's begin by discussing Sora, and honestly, I'm pretty mixed on how Sora was handled during part 2. Now, it's no secret on my channel that personally, I'm not really a big fan of Sora. Personally, I don't really consider Sora to be that interesting or engaging as a character, and overall, I think that Sora, by and large, is pretty boring. However, I did honestly like some of the things that part 2 did with Sora, and it did make me a bit more invested in her character. It wasn't anything too major or anything, but I feel like it was a step in the right direction for Sora. For starters, something that we get a chance to see with Sora is her guilt over various things. For example, the truth comes out that Sora was the one who spun the mech hand around at the end of part 1, and Eren didn't use his object spin jutsu like he thought, and this ends up creating a rift between the two of them, with Eren being really mad at Sora, and Sora doing whatever she can to try and make it up to Eren and apologize to him over what happened. Now, personally, I feel like this wasn't handled the best, and I'll get into that when I talk about Eren, but still, I like what the show was going for here. Additionally, we also see Sora feeling really bad about what happened between her and Jordana, given the way that Sora treated Jordana back when the two of them were kids at Imperium, and once again, Sora feels really bad about this, and she tries to apologize to Jordana, which I feel does actually have a big impact on Jordana's character, and once again, I'm going to get into this when I talk about Jordana. But when it comes to part 2 delving into Sora's guilt, this is something that I legitimately really like, mainly because I feel like this was a really big missed opportunity in Season 1 of Dragons Rising. In Season 1, we learned that Sora was responsible for inventing the Photech devices that the Imperium used, and the season didn't really do anything with Sora's guilt, despite setting it up during Episode 6. It was just there during episode 6, and then the show didn't really do anything else with it. But here we actually see part 2 exploring Sora's guilt, with her very clearly feeling bad about what happened and the way that she's been treating some of the characters. And Sora actually reflects on how she wasn't really the best towards some of these people, mainly Eren and Jordana. And again, this is something that I honestly really like. And this also ends up having a big effect on the characters, and again, while for Eren I feel like it wasn't handled the best, For Jordana, I did think it was handled better. Also, when it comes to Aaron, something else that we see, like I said earlier, is the two of them having this rift between the two of them, with the two of them gradually drifting further apart from each other as part 2 goes on, to the point where Aaron ends up leaving Sora and the rest of the ninja team at the end of part 2, and Sora feels really bad about this. Which I feel does make a lot of sense, given the fact that her and Aaron have been by each other's sides essentially ever since they met each other following the events of the merge, and Aaron had always been there for her for a very long time. And so when it comes to Sora, she feels really bad about what happened, and she wants to do whatever she can in order to get her friend back. This is something that I do think is actually pretty interesting, and I am honestly wondering what exactly Season 3 is going to do with this. So part 2 delving into Sora's guilt and having her reflecting on the way that she's treated the other characters, again, this is something that I did like. That being said though, there were some things about Sora that I don't think were handled that well overall when it comes to part 2. Like, for example, something that we see during part 2 is one very brief moment of Sora trying to learn Spinjitzu, with her creating a broken Spinjitzu tornado like Aaron, and that's it. Part 2 does literally nothing else with it. It's something that's just there, and then the show moves on from it and doesn't really bring this up again at any other point. And to me, this is something that feels really weird, because this is basically all the continuation that we get from Sora's story in part 1, which revolved around her learning how to use Spinjitzu, but part 2 barely does anything with it, which in my opinion feels kind of weird. But also though, and I feel like this is the bigger issue here, this is something that we get all throughout part 2, and that is part 2 constantly setting up a bunch of things, but ultimately giving us no payoff for them. Again, we get stuff like this all throughout part 2, and I'm gonna go into more examples later on during the video, but it feels really weird for the show to set up these things only for part 2 to ultimately do nothing with this stuff and essentially leave it unresolved. They could be saving this up for season 3, that is a possibility, but if that doesn't happen, then we basically just have a bunch of plot points that are left unresolved by the time part 2, and by extension season 2, comes to an end, which in my opinion feels pretty underwhelming. And then there's my other big issue with Sora during part 2, and that is her winning the Tournament of the Sources and her being declared the greatest elemental master in the merged world. And in my opinion, this is something that felt completely unearned. And here's why I feel like that. For one, Sora didn't actually win her final fight against Noct. She lost the final fight against Noct, so she didn't win the tournament because she actually defeated Noct. Secondly, the only reason why she did end up winning is because Noct was disqualified after it was revealed that Roz and Bleck were secretly working together, meaning that Noct ended up losing on a technicality and Sora won by default, meaning again she didn't actually win. And finally, Sora didn't even do that much in the final fight against Noct. Sure, she was there and she participated in it, but I'd argue that Aaron, Roz, and Kai did a lot more in the fight than Sora did. So her being the one to ultimately win, in my opinion, honestly just felt really weird overall. Also, one other thing that I want to bring up, but Sora getting the title of the greatest elemental master in the merged world, this is something else that I didn't like, because this is a continuation of a big problem that I have with Dragons Rising, and that is Dragons Rising constantly praising the new stuff over and over again. This is something that we get all throughout Dragons Rising, stuff like Lloyd telling Euphrasia, I knew the previous elemental master when I already like you better, or Lloyd on multiple occasions telling Aaron that he has the potential to become the greatest ninja in all Ninjago. I honestly really don't like moments like this, because it honestly just feels really forced whenever we get moments like this, because it doesn't feel like two characters interacting with each other, but instead it feels more like the people who are working on the show are just talking directly to us, the audience, whenever we get these moments, and it feels like the show itself is saying that the new stuff is better than what came beforehand. And honestly, as a longtime fan of the franchise, it just feels really alienating whenever we get lines like this, and it just takes me out of the show completely whenever we get stuff like this. And so again, that's something else that I didn't like. And again, that was definitely my biggest problem with Sora during part 2. Again, her winning the tournament, the sources, and it honestly feeling really unearned. But overall, when it comes to Sora, like I said, I am pretty mixed on how she was handled, because there were definitely some things about Sora that I did like during part 2, but there were also some things about her that I didn't like that much. Moving on from this, we have Zane, and honestly, I don't really think Zane was handled that well during part 2, mainly with Zane getting sidelined during part 2, and him getting essentially nothing to do at all during part 2. we see him being the first one in the tournament where he loses his powers as a result of him being the first one to lose the tournament. And by the way, as a Zane fan, that's something that I really didn't like. And really, other than that, Zane didn't really get that much during part 2. He was just kind of there, essentially. And again, Zane ended up getting sidelined during part 2, so he didn't really get that much to do overall. We saw Zane learning Rising Dragon technique towards the beginning of part 2, which was nice, but the show doesn't really do that much with this. We do see Zane using Rising Dragon technique towards the end of part 2 during the fight against Noct and Rox, but that's about it. This doesn't really come back in a major way, and besides, Zane isn't the only one who knows Rising Dragon technique. The other members of the team also know it. And so this feels like yet another moment of setup with essentially no payoff, and so overall, I just didn't think Zane was handled that well. After this, we have Kai, and I'm also pretty mixed on how Kai was handled during part 2. So when it comes to Kai, obviously he got stuck in Nether Space at the end of part 1, and so that's where he spends a majority of part 2. And as a result of this, we don't really get that much screen time from Kai, and he doesn't really get that much to do overall during part 2. And this is the big reason why I'm mixed on Kai, because on the one hand, I really did want to see more stuff from Kai, because I feel like Dragon's Rising has done a really great job at handling him so far, and I did definitely want to see more stuff from him. So seeing that he didn't get that much to do during part 2, that's something that I didn't like. But on the other hand, I do feel like out of all the members of the original team, after Lloyd obviously, who's still a main character, Kai had definitely been getting the most amount of screen time and focus when it came to Dragon's Rising, and so I do like that with Kai essentially taking a backseat, it allowed some of the other members of the original team to get more screen time and stuff to do. And when it comes to part 2, I feel like we saw this with both Nia and Cole getting more things to do, which is something that I did like. And again, that's the big reason why I'm mixed on this, because I did want to see Kai get more stuff to do, but on the other hand, some of the other members of the team also got more screen time, which is something that I liked. With that being said, though, I did really like seeing Kai's return at the very end of part 2 and him not holding back at all during his fight against Noct in order to protect Nia, Wildfire, and the rest of the team. That is something that I did honestly really like, and I did think it was great getting a chance to see Kai reunite with everyone, and I also like that at the very end of Season 2, we see Kai and Nia planning to go out and find Jay following what happened during the tournament. That was something else that I liked, but overall, like I said, when it comes to Kai, I'm pretty mixed on how he was handled. Moving on from this, we have Cole, and when it comes to Cole, I feel like he was honestly handled pretty well during part 2. For starters, we get some really great characterization for Cole, with him teaching Frack, one of the new characters that we met during this season, how to use his elemental powers of Earth, and essentially acting like a mentor to Frack, even though Frack was a member of Roz's team, and therefore he was one of the opponents that the ninja had to fight against during the tournament, Cole still helped him out anyway. And this is something that I honestly really liked, mainly because a big part of Cole's character has always been his kindness and him being a good person, so him helping out Frack is something that made a lot of sense. We also see some more stuff with Cole following the mysterious Sensei Wu's spirit, which is something that we've seen a few times during Dragon's Rising at this point, and part 2 finally reveals that the mysterious Sensei Wu's spirit is Wu himself, and in the process of Cole following the spirit, we actually see Cole using a giant mech that was originally used by his mom, Lily, and by actually tapping into the mech's power and remembering his mom, Cole's actually able to channel some of his elemental power through the mech, which I think is honestly a pretty interesting concept. We also get some more stuff revolving around Cole and Geo, and the show hinting that either the two of them are in a relationship or the two of them are going to end up in one at some point. And this is something that I'm going to get into later on during the video when I talk about Geo, but it is definitely something that we saw a lot of during part 2. And overall, when it comes to Cole, I feel like he was honestly handled pretty well during part 2. However, one problem that I did have with Cole during part 2 is that part 2 doesn't do anything to continue on with Cole's journey, even though that was a big thing that was set up for Cole at the end of Season 1, and Cole briefly mentioned it during part 1. Part 2 does absolutely nothing with this, which in my opinion feels really weird considering how much the show has been building up to it. Hopefully in Season 3 we do finally see something with it, but again, I do think it is pretty weird that Dragon's Rising has been building up to the story for Cole, only for the show to so far have not really done anything with it. In my opinion, that does feel kind of weird, but again, by and large, I did think that Cole was handled pretty well during part 2. And then we have Nia, and I also think that Nia was handled really well when it came to part 2. For one, we saw a more emotional and essentially a more vulnerable side of Nia when it came to part 2, given how Nia was going through a lot of things like Kai being stuck in nether space, as well as the reveal of Jay being turned into a bad guy. Again, we saw a more emotional and really more vulnerable side of Nia during part 2. A lot more than what we've seen from Nia over the show, and this is something that I honestly really liked for a few reasons. For one, Nia basically ended up using her emotions as a source of motivation during the tournament, with her pushing herself and fighting a lot harder as a result of everything that she was going through, essentially almost as a way to work through those tough emotions, which is something that I did think was pretty interesting. Additionally though, when it came to Nia being more emotional, this basically put her in a reverse of the situation that she was in during part 1, where during part 1, Nia was the one who was helping the characters going through their emotional struggles, but now when it comes to part 2, Nia was the one going through those emotional struggles and she needed the help of the other characters in order to work through them. Again, essentially putting Nia in a reverse of the situation that she was in during part 1, which is something that I do think is honestly pretty interesting. And also, I honestly really like that we're getting a chance to see a more emotional side of Nia, because something that we always saw when it came to Ninjago was Nia having trouble with properly expressing her emotions and really showing how she was feeling. It took Nia a long time in order to properly express how she was feeling in a number of situations. I mean, it took her all the way until Seabound for her to finally tell Jay that she loved him. So when it comes to us seeing Nia as being more emotional, I feel like that shows just how much Nia's grown and changed over the years and how much she's emotionally developed, with her being a lot more comfortable with showing her emotions in front of the other characters. It's something that I think is honestly really great to see. I also like that when it comes to part 2, it finally gives Nia an overarching story for Dragons Rising, with her planning on going out in order to try and find Jay. And this is something that I really like, because I feel like when it comes to Nia, she was the only one who either didn't have an overarching story, or the show hadn't set up an overarching story for her. Meanwhile, for the rest of the team, they all had those. For Lloyd, you obviously have him being a mentor and him teaching Eren and Sora. For Kai, you have him essentially being a surrogate father for Wildfire, and the two of them having a father and daughter-like relationship. For Cole, there's the whole thing with the mysterious Sensei Wu's spirit leading him on that journey, as well as him trying to figure out why the Earth is screaming. For Jay, it's him losing his memories and him not knowing about who he is. And for Zane, it's him trying to prove to people that he's more than just a robot. When it comes to Nia, again, I feel like she didn't really have that up until part 2, where they do finally give her an overarching story, which is something that I do like. That being said though, there is one major issue that I have when it comes to Nia during part 2, and it's that partway during part 2, Nia just disappears altogether. That is until towards the end of part 2, where it's revealed that Nia and Ryu were apparently taken prisoner by Rox, one of the members of the Forbidden Five, and the show did literally nothing to set this up or hint at it at any point until after Nia was freed. That entire thing happened completely off screen. And this is another major issue that I have when it comes to part 2. There are so many things that happen completely off screen when it comes to part 2, and we don't find out about certain things that have happened until after those things have already happened. Meaning that we essentially get a reverse of the situation that I talked about earlier, where it feels like we get set up with no payoff. When it comes to the stuff that happens off screen, it feels like we get payoff with basically no setup. And I feel like with these two things combined, it ultimately just results in part 2 feeling like a really unsatisfying viewing experience. Because for the most part, when it came to part 2, it felt like things just happened during part 2. Stuff just happened independently of each other, and it didn't really feel like one thing happened as a result of something else that happened during the plot. A lot of things honestly felt disconnected due to us getting a lot of setup and no payoff, and a lot of payoff with no setup. And again, I feel like that just made part 2 overall feel pretty underwhelming, and it's something that I wasn't the biggest fan of. And when it comes to Nia being taken prisoner by Rox, again, this I feel is an example of that. But overall, when it comes to Nia, I do feel like she was handled really well during part 2, again, except for her getting captured off screen. So, moving on from the ninja, for now, I'm going to discuss Lloyd, Eren, and Jay later on during the video. Let's take a look at some of the other characters during the season, starting off with the heroes, both new and old, and let's begin by discussing Wildfire, who continues to be the best new hero when it comes to Dragons Rising. As always, I really liked Wildfire when it came to part 2. For one, something that I liked about Wildfire is, just like Nia, we see a more emotional side of Wildfire during part 2, with her grieving through Kai's sacrifice and her trying to find a way to work through it. And this is something that I honestly really liked, because this is something that we saw with Wildfire back with the Wildfire miniseries that we got, with Wildfire trying to work through her grief revolving around Kai's sacrifice, with her ultimately deciding that she is going to become the new Red Ninja in Kai's place, and she's going to continue on the legacy that Kai started. That is an idea for Wildfire that I honestly really liked, and I'm really glad that part 2 ended up continuing on with this, with Wildfire taking on the role of the Red Ninja in Kai's place. It's an idea that I think was honestly handled pretty well, and it does make sense given how much Kai and Wildfire mean to each other. So that's something that I did like. Also, just like Nia, we saw Wildfire using her emotions essentially as a source of motivation during the tournament, which is something else that I liked. However, that's not all, because we also see a few other interesting sides of Wildfire during part 2. For example, we see a more intelligent side of Wildfire during part 2, with her and Eren trying to figure out the truth behind the Tournament of the Sources, and Wildfire even figuring out how to get Bleck's book away from him all on her own, which is something that I thought was pretty cool. We also see a more friendlier side of Wildfire, with her befriending Zur, one of the new characters who we meet during the season, and thanks to their friendship, Wildfire is actually able to learn the truth behind the Tournament of the Sources and what's really going on. And this is something in particular that I really liked, because this is basically a continuation of Wildfire's overall story for Dragons Rising, which revolves around her learning how to better work alongside other people, so her becoming friends with Zur is something that I liked. And we also saw a more, romantic side of Wildfire during part 2, with her falling in love with Roby, another one of the new characters that we met during part 2, and I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't really a big fan of this relationship overall. For one, I just did not like Roby. I really was not a fan of him at all when it came to part 2, and I'm gonna explain why when I get to him. But when it comes to relationships in Ninjago, for me personally, I really like the relationships where I like both characters in the relationship. This is a big reason why I like relationships like Jay and Nia, Zane and Pixel, and Lloyd and Nikita, for example. For me, when it comes to these relationships, I like both characters in the relationships. Yet when it comes to Roby and Wildfire, again, I just like Wildfire and not Roby, so that's an issue that I had. But also, I feel like when it came to Roby and Wildfire essentially flirting with each other, it's something that honestly I thought was kind of awkward and annoying during part 2, and it's something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of overall. That being said, though, it's obvious that the two of them do like one another and they make each other happy, and we do see that the two of them are on good terms at the end of Season 2, so I can't really complain that much about it. But still, overall, when it comes to this relationship, I wasn't really a big fan of it overall. But by and large, when it comes to Wildfire, I did honestly really like her during part 2, again, except for her relationship with Roby. I wasn't really the biggest fan of that. Moving on from this, I'm now going to list off a bunch of characters who showed up during part 2, but I don't really have that much to say about any of them, mainly because a majority of them just don't really get anything to do when it comes to part 2. With those characters being Ryu, Egalt, Rontu, Bonzel, Euphrasia, and Geo. None of these characters really get that much to do during part 2, and I don't really have that much to say about any of them really. Ryu does get a bit more, with him and Kai being able to communicate with one another, because some of Ryu's scales fell onto Kai when he went through the portal into Nether Space. So Kai's able to communicate with Ryu, and he's able to transfer that power to Nia, and the two of them are able to get Kai and Bonds on another space, which is nice, but that's really all I have to say about Ryu. There isn't really that much for me to say about him when it comes to part 2. Egalt and Rontu show up towards the beginning of part 2, and we see the two of them in a brief flashback at one point, but that's basically it. By and large, I just don't really have that much to say about them. We see them teaching Zane how to use Rising Dragon technique, and they're able to help Lloyd realize that he needs to become a master, but that's about it. Again, we don't really get that much from either one of them. Bonzel barely gets anything to do during part 2, and this is one thing in particular that I wasn't really a big fan of, mainly because I feel like part 1 was able to do a really great job at turning Bonzel into a legitimately compelling and engaging character, yet part 2 barely did anything with her, and she barely had a dynamic with Kai during part 2, which is something that honestly I really didn't like all that much. And then there's Euphrasia and Geo, who both continue to be pretty boring characters who I don't think are very interesting or compelling overall, and I barely have anything to say about either one of them. Except for Geo, because like I said earlier, part 2 does lean more into the idea of him and Cole either being in a relationship or the two of them potentially getting together. And it's at this point I do want to discuss my thoughts on these two as a potential couple when it comes to Ninjago. And to be honest with you guys, I'm fine with this. Initially, I wasn't super sure about this, mainly because I feel like Dragon's Rising didn't really give us that many moments of chemistry between these two characters. We had a couple of scenes when it came to Season 1 and Part 1 of Season 2, so I wasn't super sure about this, but Part 2 I feel did end up giving us a lot more moments of chemistry with these two characters, and it did further sell me on the idea of these two potentially getting together at some point. That being said, though, there is one problem that I do have with the relationship, and it's like I said earlier, personally, I'm just not that really a big fan of Geo overall. I don't think he's that particularly interesting or compelling as a character overall. And like I said when I talked about Wildfire and Roby, for me personally, when it comes to Ninjago relationships, for me, I prefer the relationships where I'm invested in both characters. Yet when it comes to the relationship between Cole and Geo, again, I'm really only invested in Cole as a character, not really Geo. So the show is gonna have to change around my opinion on him in order for me to be really invested in the relationship. Although that's not impossible, considering the fact that when it comes to Dragon's Rising, it was able to change around my opinions on characters like Bonzel and Noct. So who knows, this might happen with Geo at some point, but we're just going to have to wait and see. But again, overall, when it comes to the idea of Cole and Geo either getting together or already being together, again, personally, I'm fine with this. But again, the show is going to have to change around my opinion of Geo as a character in order for me to be fully on board with this. Now, moving on, I now want to discuss a group of returning heroes that we got when it came to Part 2, because during Part 2, we actually saw some of the old Elemental Masters show up, with not one, not two, not even three, but 4 Elemental Masters returning during Part 2, and I loved this. I have made it incredibly clear, basically ever since the beginning of Dragon's Rising, that I think the merge basically getting rid of all the old characters and making it incredibly unclear when or even if they were going to show up was not a good idea, and I've made it clear for a long time that I have really wanted to see the older characters show up in Dragon's Rising, and I am so glad that during Part 2, we got some more returning characters showing up. I thought that was awesome. I will admit, though, I do wish that the returning Elemental Masters got more stuff to do during Part 2, because by and large, they didn't really get that much to do. They were basically just opponents during the tournament, and that was pretty much it. But still, the fact that we did get some of the older Elemental Masters returning is something that I did really like. And when it came to Pale Man, we got something with him that I did really want to see, and that was us seeing Pale Man being visible instead of invisible. That's something that I did honestly like, although that is retconning what happened during Season 4 when Pale Man lost his powers and he remained invisible, so that did feel kind of weird. Although, to be completely honest with you guys, this is one of the very, very few retcons in Dragon's Rising that I don't have a problem with, which is something I really can't say about any of the other retcons that we've gotten so far. But again, the fact that we got some more returning characters showing up during Part 2, this is something that I really, really liked, and I really hope that going forward, we get a chance to see more returning characters showing up. Based on the set leaks, it looks like Pixel's going to be showing up during Season 3, and I couldn't be happier for this. Moving on from this, now I'm going to discuss the new heroes that we got during Part 2, starting off with Frack, who I am counting as a hero because he wasn't really a bad guy when it came to Part 2. And honestly, Frack was the only new character that we got during Part 2 who I actually liked, and even then I didn't think he was that good. For starters, when it comes to Frack, we learned that just like Eren, he is a big fan of the ninja, and the two of them were actually best friends prior to the merge happening. And when it comes to Frack, he is a big fan of Cole, and we actually see Frack going to Cole for advice on how to use his earth powers during the tournament. And like I said, that is something that I did honestly like when it came to part 2. Additionally, something else about Frack that I liked is that during his match against Sora during the tournament, Frack didn't resort to using dirty tricks by using the wolf mask in order to make himself stronger, but instead, he decided to try and win the fight on his own terms. That is honestly something that I did like, but overall, when it comes to Frack, that's really it in terms of the positive stuff. I don't really have that much to say about him because I don't think Frack is a very interesting or compelling character overall. However, there is one pretty big issue that I have when it comes to Frack, and it's my genuine confusion over how exactly did Frack work for Roz for so long without knowing that he was a bad guy or that he recruited Jay and turned him into a bad guy. The show doesn't really do anything to explain how Frack was this unaware of stuff when it came to Roz, and Aaron even pointed this out that Roz was a bad guy, and Frack was really confused by this, which is something that I'm genuinely really confused by. Again, how did Frack go for so long without knowing anything about Roz or who he was or what was going on with Jay? Again, the show does literally nothing to explain this, so I'm really confused over what's going on here. But overall, when it comes to Frack, like I said, he was the only new character that we got during part 2 that I did like, but again, overall, I didn't think he was that great. Moving on from this, we then have Roby and Blecht, and honestly, I wasn't really a fan of either one of them. Starting off with Roby, I honestly thought he was just a really, really annoying character when it came to part 2. I get what the show was trying to go for with Roby, with the idea of him being an influencer type character, with him doing stuff like constantly being on his phone, him trying to promote the term and the sources, him using buzzwords, stuff like that. But honestly, again, I just thought this came off as being really, really annoying during part 2, and it's something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of. Again, I get what the show is trying to go for with Roby, but in my opinion, it felt a bit too how do you do, fellow kids, if I'm being honest with you guys. And then there's Blecht, who I honestly just thought was a really boring character who wasn't that interesting. His entire character and personality is him not liking Roby because he's changing up the tournament of the sources and doing things differently, with him considering the tournament to be sacred. And again, he doesn't like Roby for changing things and doing stuff differently. And overall, again, I just thought that Blecht was honestly pretty bland. Also, though, when it comes to Blecht, one thing about him that I really didn't like was the big twist towards the end of part 2, where it was revealed that Blecht and Roz were secretly working together the entire time, and as it turns out, the tournament was actually rigged in order to try and get the ninja to fail. And when it came to Blecht, the reason why he did this was simply because he didn't like Roby changing up the tournament, and he thought that if Roby was gone, then he would be able to turn the tournament back to the way it was initially. And this, to me, honestly felt like a pretty weak and petty motivation for Blecht to do what he did. But here's the thing, I genuinely don't know if that was intentional or not. I don't know if the show was intentionally making Blecht's motivation really petty and weak so that way we would just dislike him more, or if the show wanted us to take this seriously. Again, I genuinely cannot tell, but either way, I just feel like it didn't really work out all that well, and in my opinion, it just made Blecht, honestly, an even worse character overall. And so overall, when it came to Blecht and Roby, again, honestly, I just didn't really like either one of them when it came to part 2. So moving on from this, let's now discuss the villains that we got during part 2, and there were a lot of villains during part 2, and I have a lot of stuff to say when it comes to them. So for starters, let's quickly discuss Raptin, because he briefly showed up during the first episode, and honestly, this is something that I really liked. Raptin was one of my favorite new characters that we got during Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, and he was honestly one of the few new characters that we got during Season 1 who I actually liked, so I did like seeing him briefly showing up during Season 2. I thought he was pretty funny during his one appearance, and I did like that Season 2 kept him as a bad guy, because even though Raptin did help out the ninja at the end of Season 1, he wasn't doing it for a good reason, and he wasn't doing it because he realized that what he had been doing was wrong and he wanted to change or anything. No, he just wanted to take down Beatrix so that way he could continue hunting in the merged world. That was it. So again, I do like that Season 2 kept him as a bad guy. That's something that I did like. Moving on from this, we have Rox, one of the members of the Forbidden Five that we meet during part 2, and honestly, I just don't really have that much to say about her. Rox overall honestly just felt like a pretty bland character who wasn't that interesting, and really the only interesting about her that I can say is that she was the one who was possessing Jordana all throughout part 2, which is something, but by and large, I just don't really have that much to say about her overall, because honestly, I just didn't really think Rox left that much of an impact when it came to part 2. After this, we have Zeatrix, who actually makes a proper appearance during Season 2, and honestly, Zeatrix is probably my least favorite new character that we got when it came to part 2. I really didn't like her. For one, Zeatrix was basically just Beatrix all over again. The two of them both being these really angry villains who don't like the ninja and they have some kind of vendetta against Roz for some reason, with the two of them gradually becoming more aggressive and crazy as the show goes on, with that craziness and aggression ultimately leading to their defeat by one of the ninja at some point towards the end of the season. Again, the two of them, by and large, character and personality-wise, honestly felt pretty similar to one another. And also, speaking of similarities, we see that Zeatrix looks identical to Beatrix, and this is never explained. The show does absolutely nothing to explain why these two look like one another, which made Zeatrix's appearance feel kinda confusing, because it feels like this was done just to trick people into thinking that Beatrix was going to be returning, only for it to be revealed that it wasn't the case. And again, the show does nothing to explain this. Also, speaking of the show not explaining anything, the show does literally nothing to explain why Zeatrix is out of Imperium and what happened to her following her being imprisoned by Beatrix. We don't know whether or not Zeatrix was able to escape before Beatrix was defeated, or if it happened after she was defeated. All we know is that at some point Zeatrix got out of Imperium, but again, it's never explained because this is something else that happens completely off screen. So that's something else that I didn't like. And finally, one last thing that I want to bring up when it comes to Zeatrix, but this season finally reveals the name of Zeatrix's elemental power, with us learning that the name of Zeatrix's power is Shockwave. And here's my question: why was this kept a secret? I genuinely don't really know why the show felt the need to keep this a secret, considering that the actual reveal of Zeatrix's power didn't really have an impact on the plot in any way. The show did it pretty casually, and the show moves on from it pretty quickly after the name is revealed. And so again, I'm just wondering, why was this kept a mystery? I genuinely don't get it. Although I feel like this is a symptom of Dragons Rising feeling the need to make everything a mystery and introduce a ton of mysteries and unanswered questions, which is something that honestly I'm not really a big fan of, because I feel like whenever the show does do this and leaves those mysteries unresolved by the time a season comes to an end, it ultimately just creates a really unsatisfying viewing experience, because it just feels like there's a lot of plot points that are left unresolved by the time a season comes to an end as a result of a ton of things being left vague and unclear. I understand what the show is doing by having these mysteries and unanswered questions, but again, personally, I feel like it just creates a pretty unsatisfying viewing experience when we have so many things left unclear by the time a season comes to an end. And overall, when it comes to Zeatrix, again, she was honestly my least favorite new character that we got when it came to part 2. Moving on from this, we now have the villains that I actually liked when it came to part 2, starting off with Jordana, and even though technically we didn't get that much from Jordana during part 2, I did still like the few moments that we did get with her. So, like I said, technically we didn't get that much from Jordana during part 2, given the fact that she was possessed by Rox for a majority of it. However, I still really like the few moments that we did get with Jordana. Mainly with her trying to help out the ninja by trying to warn Sora about what was going on with Noct and Rox, as well as that small moment that I brought up earlier with Sora trying to apologize to Jordana for the way she treated her back when the two of them were kids at Imperium, and stuff like this combined with Jordana being possessed by Rox, as well as the stuff that Jordana in general went through during Season 2, I feel like all of this has been building up a redemption story that Jordana will eventually get at some point. When it comes to Season 2, it was made pretty clear that Jordana wasn't really fully on board with the idea of being a bad guy, and she was really only doing what she was doing in order to try and get back at Sora because of the rivalry that the two of them had. However, I feel like after everything that Jordana went through during season 2, she realized that when it came to everything that was going on, she was in way over her head, and none of this stuff is what she actually wanted. And I feel like that's something that we can especially see during part 2, with Jordana being genuinely terrified after everything that she went through, especially with her being possessed by rocks. It's something that she really did not want to happen, and I feel like this in particular had a really big effect on her. And I feel like when it came to Sora apologizing to Jordana, it actually gave her the push that she needed in order to further fight back against rocks, by essentially realizing that when it came to her fighting with Sora, it was ultimately pointless in the end. And again, I feel like this is going to push Jordana to ultimately go down a redemption arc at some point later on during Dragon's Rising, which is something that I think would actually be something really interesting to see. And I think if her and Sora were able to make amends and become friends, I feel like that could be something really great for both their characters. But overall, when it comes to Jordana, again, even though we didn't get that much from her, I did really like the few moments of her that we did get during part 2. So, moving on from this, we have Noct, and to be completely honest with you guys, going into part 2, I didn't really think that much about Noct, mainly because in my opinion, in part 1, Noct wasn't really all that impressive. He just showed up during the final episode, and then he was defeated pretty easily by both the ninja and Roz. So overall, I just didn't really think that much of him, but part 2 definitely changed my opinion on this guy, and I really liked what I saw. For one, we got a chance to see just how strong and powerful Noct was, with him absolutely bulldozing his way through the tournament, taking out fighter after fighter during all the matches that he was in. And this is something that I really liked, because it showed us that Noct is a force to be reckoned with, and he is not someone who should be taken lightly. That was already something pretty cool, but that's not all. We also got a chance to learn a bit more about the history of the Forbidden Five, with us seeing a flashback scene showing them trying to take over the wildness, and in the process, we learned that they actually defeated presumably one of Roz's ancestors. And I feel like this ends up making the hatred between Noct and Roz all the more personal, considering the fact that when it comes to Roz, again, one of his ancestors was defeated by the Forbidden Five, giving these two parties all the more reason to hate one another, which I think is pretty interesting. And speaking of Roz, I honestly really like that during part 2, we learned that Noct was secretly working against Roz the entire time, and him and Rox had their own plan. Which you could already tell based on part 1, it was pretty obvious that Noct wasn't going to be serving Roz the entire time, and he had his own plans going on, and during part 2, we see that, with us learning that Noct and Rox had apparently defeated and killed multiple Arc Dragons in order to take their horns in order to bring back the Forbidden Five, and they were planning on betraying Roz the entire time. And something that I really like is the way that they end up betraying Roz is by using his own hubris against him, because during the final match of the tournament, Noct ends up fighting against Sora, the elemental master of technology, who was actually able to remove the control device from the back of Noct's head, thus freeing him from Roz's control, something that Roz did not think about. And once he is free, Noct does not hold back against Roz, once again thus further increasing the hatred between these two, and Noct and the Forbidden Five ultimately end up defeating Roz in the end, which is something that I think is pretty interesting, given the fact that when it comes to Roz, we've consistently seen him come out on top over and over again whenever he's been involved in fights, yet in this instance, he was actually defeated, once again showing just how strong the Forbidden Five really are, showing that these guys are definitely gonna be a challenge for the ninja going forward. And so, overall, when it comes to Noct, I honestly really liked what we got with him during part 2, and again, part 2 definitely changed around my opinion on Noct. And then finally, we have Roz, who continues to be the best new character that we've gotten when it comes to Dragon's Rising. I really liked Roz during part 2. So for starters, something that I like is that part 2 gives us more stuff with Roz being a teacher, which is something that was set up during part 1 of Dragon's Rising, and this is something that I really liked because it shows us the differing teaching styles of both Roz and Lloyd, with Roz putting more of an emphasis on strength above all else, while Lloyd focuses on other things, showing us how different these two are when it comes to their teaching methods, which is something that I thought was interesting. Additionally, like I said earlier, we get some more interesting stuff between Roz and the Forbidden Five, with us learning that one of Roz's ancestors was defeated by the Forbidden 5 years ago, thus making the hatred between these two parties all the more personal and making it that much more of a bigger deal by adding a new layer to it. However, in addition to that, we also see the Forbidden 5 ultimately betraying Roz towards the end of part 2, with them fighting back against Roz and ultimately defeating him. And this is something else that I really liked because, as I said earlier, when it comes to Roz, we've always seen him come out on top whenever he's gotten involved in fights, but this time Roz was defeated by the Forbidden 5, showing that they are not messing around and they are a force to be reckoned with. And I feel like as a result of Roz being defeated by the Forbidden 5, that's just going to make him hate the Forbidden 5 all the more, and it's going to make the interactions between these two parties all the more interesting going forward when it comes to Dragons Rising. Because Roz is going to have even more of a reason to fight back against the Forbidden 5 considering his defeat. However, the biggest thing that we get a chance to see with Roz during part 2 is him manipulating people. This is definitely a really big part of Roz's character, and when it comes to part 2, we get even more of that with Roz trying to drive a wedge in between the ninja team. And he does this by doing two things. And when it comes to Roz, he does this in two ways. For one, he recruits Jay and turns him into a bad guy, and him and Nia end up fighting against each other during the tournament. And something that I like is that after Jay and Nia fight against each other, when the ninja go to confront Roz, he actually calls them out on not looking for Jay and pointing out how because the ninja didn't do that, he's become a bad guy now. And this is something that I honestly really like, because something that I feel like would make a lot of sense as a bigger plot point for Dragons Rising is the ninja going out and looking for their friends and family following the merge, yet so far when it comes to Dragons Rising, we've barely gotten that. And so I like that when it comes to one of the characters, they've actually pointed out the negative consequences of the ninja not looking for their friends. Again, this is something that I honestly really like, but the other major thing that we see when it comes to Roz manipulating people is with Eren, with Roz doing what he can to try and manipulate Eren in order to turn him to the side of darkness, which is something that was set up towards the end of part 1, but in part 2 we see more of that, with Roz revealing a lot of stuff to Eren, including that his overall goal is to actually undo the merge, although it's possible that this could be a lie, it's a bit unclear at this point. But also, Roz reveals that Sora used her powers at the end of part 1, and that Sensei Wu was responsible for starting the merge in the first place. And these things ultimately result in Eren becoming more disillusioned with the ninja team and ultimately turning against them and joining Roz's side. And while personally I feel like this wasn't really handled the best, and again I'll explain why when I get to Eren, I do still like that we're getting more stuff with Roz manipulating people, considering that again this is a really big part of his character. And so overall when it comes to Roz, again like always I really liked Roz, and again he continues to be my favorite new character that we've gotten when it comes to Dragons Rising. Taking a break from the characters though, let's now talk about something else when it comes to part 2, with us talking about the production value, and as usual, I thought that the production value was really, really good. The animation, as per usual, is absolutely fantastic, with the visuals being really, really great, and the fight scenes looked absolutely incredible, with Dragons Rising continuously being able to improve on the fight scenes and fight choreography, especially after what we had during Season 1 with them not really looking that great overall. Season 2, I feel, was definitely able to step it up in a major way, especially during part 2, with a lot of the fight scenes looking genuinely fantastic from an animation perspective. Seriously, they were fantastic. We also have the voice actors, and just like usual, the voice actors did an absolutely fantastic job when they voiced their characters during part 2, and then there's the music, which once again, as per usual, when it comes to Ninjago, is absolutely incredible, and overall, when it comes to production value, it was really, really good in my opinion. So, moving on from this, I now want to discuss the Tournament of the Sources. The Tournament of the Sources was definitely a major plot point for Part 2 of Season 2, which makes sense given that this is what Part 2 focused on. However, I honestly feel like the tournament was not handled well during Part 2 at all, and I had numerous major issues with it. For starters, a major issue that I had with the tournament was the amount of stuff that was left really vague and unclear when it came to the tournament. There were so many things that we were made completely unaware of when it came to the tournament until after a certain thing happened. Like, for example, the bracket for the tournament and who would be going up against who. That was never really revealed during the events of Part 2, and in my opinion, this made the matches feel pretty random overall. I get what the show was trying to go for because, as Roby says, he wanted to keep the bracket a secret so no one would know who they were going up against. And again, I get what the show was trying to go for here. It was trying to make it a big deal for the in-universe audience. But personally, I just feel like this made the actual rounds feel kinda random at times. And then there was the whole power transfer idea, and this, in my opinion, was one of the worst parts about the tournament, mainly because I feel like when this idea was first introduced, and when the obvious question was asked of what if a bad guy gets access to all the elemental powers, then it became way too obvious where the plot was gonna go. Nox was going to defeat every opponent that he went up against during the tournament, he was going to win the tournament, he was going to get access to all the elemental powers, and then he was going to do something bad. Again, this idea I think was one of the worst parts about the tournament because it just made things way too obvious when it came to the plot, and I feel like it just took away a lot of the stakes and tension from Part 2 because again, the overall plot just became kinda obvious. Also, when it comes to the powers, that's another big problem that I have when it comes to the tournament. A lot of the new powers that we were introduced to, I feel, weren't really that good overall, because I feel like when it came to just about every new power that we were introduced to, they fit into one of two categories. Either A, it was another fire and heat situation where we were introduced to a bunch of new powers that felt way too similar to powers that we had already gotten. Like, for example, reflexes felt a bit too similar to speed, quake felt too similar to earth, plants felt too similar to nature, stuff like that. And I was fine when Dragon's Rising did this with fire and heat because that was a one-time situation and that was it. But now that we have a bunch of other elemental powers that just feel too similar to powers that already exist, now that is a problem that I have. And then when it came to the other category, that would be the powers that felt a bit too similar to tech in the sense that they were the powers that didn't really feel like elemental powers. Stuff like figment, size, balance, surface tension. Stuff like that. Just, these powers didn't really feel like elemental powers, and they just felt really strange overall when it came to the show. And once again, it's something that I really didn't like when it came to the powers, mainly because a lot of these elemental powers either A, didn't really feel like elemental powers, or again, also, they just felt like repeats of powers that we had already seen. And then there's my biggest overall problem with the tournament, and that is it basically just being a repeat of the Tournament of Elements. This was the biggest thing that a lot of people were concerned about going into Part 2, that this new tournament would be a bit too similar to the original tournament that we got back during Season 4. And in my opinion, yeah, both tournaments ended up feeling too similar to each other, and I don't even mean that in the sense that the Tournament of the Sources and the Tournament of Elements felt too similar to each other. I mean that Part 2 in general honestly just felt too similar to Season 4, because there were a lot of similarities between these two. Like, for example, the ninja get involved in a mysterious tournament consisting of elemental masters, with the loser losing access to their elemental powers. Two of the ninja aren't able to compete in the tournament because one of them was imprisoned as a result of actions from the main antagonist for the season, while the other one doesn't have elemental powers, so they try and figure out the truth behind the tournament. Zane is the first elemental master to lose access to his elemental powers. The red ninja ends up getting a romance subplot during the season. Two of the ninja have to fight against each other at one point during the season, with Jay being involved in both of the fights. The main antagonist needs to get access to all the elemental powers in order to enact some kind of evil plan that they have. The main villain ends up getting betrayed at some point towards the end of the season. The main army of the villain ends up undergoing a transformation sequence where they end up turning purple and they get stronger as a result of the transformation. The depowered elemental masters work together in order to fight back against the main army of the antagonist before they ultimately get their powers back. And so much more. I didn't go over every similarity, but trust me, there are a lot more similarities between Part 2 of Season 2 and the original Tournament of Elements. And it's something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of. I will admit that not everything is identical between these two, and there are definitely differences, but there were too many similarities for me not to notice. And it's something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of, because when it came to Part 2, it kind of just felt like Season 4 all over again, which is something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of. Oh, also, one other thing that I want to point out, but when it comes to part 2, it ends up retconning the original Tournament of Elements by saying that Chen was inspired by the Tournament of the Sources when creating the original tournaments, which straight up isn't true at all, because Season 4 made it really clear that Chen was inspired by the Anacondrae, and they're saying only one can remain when he made the tournament, and the season didn't do anything to imply that Chen was inspired by anything else when making the tournament. Again, Chen was inspired by the Anacondrae, not the Tournament of the Sources. And so, overall, when it came to the tournaments, again, personally, I feel like it honestly wasn't really handled that well when it came to part 2. But now, it's time for me to talk about my favorite and least favorite parts of part 2. And when it comes to my favorite part about part 2, just like always when it comes to Dragons Rising, it would have to be Lloyd. I really liked how Lloyd was handled during part 2. For one, part 2 continues on with Lloyd's master story, something that we've seen with Lloyd all throughout Dragons Rising. And something that I like is that when it comes to Lloyd, he's not just a mentor for Eren and Sora during part 2, but instead, Lloyd acts as a mentor for the rest of the team, which is something that I think is honestly really great to see, especially considering the fact that this is something that Sensei Wu initially would have done, but now Lloyd's the one who's in that position, and he's the one who's teaching the rest of the ninja team. Even though Lloyd is clearly struggling at it, and he isn't the best at the job right now, Lloyd's still trying, and he's giving it the best that he's got, and we can see that Lloyd is improving and getting better as time goes on. That is something that I do like, and as I pointed out earlier, Egalt and Rontu were able to help Lloyd realize that he needs to become a master for the rest of the ninja team. And during part 2, we even get a chance to see Lloyd finally wearing the master robes, which I think is absolutely amazing. However, that's not all, because another thing that we see continue with Lloyd during part 2 is his struggles and worries surrounding his visions. Something that I think is really interesting is that part 2 didn't have Lloyd letting go of his struggles and worries surrounding the visions that he had, and this is something that I honestly really like, given the fact that when it comes to Lloyd's visions, they're meant to be an allegory for mental health, and mental health issues aren't things that just go away after a certain amount of time. It's something that a person needs to work through, and that's exactly what we see with Lloyd all throughout Season 2. He finds a way to work through his visions in order to find a way to overcome them and stop worrying about them. And that's something that we do see with Lloyd during part 2, with him once again being worried about a lot of different things that he gets with his visions, like we saw during part 1. However, Lloyd's ultimately able to realize that he needs to overcome the visions and let go of his worries surrounding them and just embrace them. Not only that though, but Lloyd also realizes that he can't keep on being afraid of the visions all the time, otherwise that's not going to get him anywhere, and so Lloyd ultimately is able to overcome his fear surrounding his visions and ultimately fight back against them as well, showing that when it comes to Lloyd's visions, they aren't set in stone and he does have the ability to change things in order to make the future that he wants. Which is something that I think is honestly really, really cool to see. We also see something else really interesting with Lloyd towards the end of part 2, and that's him becoming slightly disillusioned with Wu after he learns that Wu was responsible for the merge starting in the first place, causing Lloyd to question a lot of things when it comes to Sensei Wu, which I think is actually something kind of interesting, and I am wondering where this is going to go in the future of Dragons Rising. And also, one other thing about Lloyd that I really liked is that after everything that he did during Season 2, especially during Part 2, he was actually able to gain the favor of the Source Dragons, and he was even able to get a dragon icon from the Source Dragon emotion. And I think that this is definitely a big deal, given the fact that Lloyd is a person, yet he was able to gain the favor of essentially gods of the Ninjago world, which is something that I think is honestly really impressive, and it shows just how much of an impact Lloyd was able to have on the Source Dragons, which again, I think that is honestly pretty interesting, and it shows just how big of a deal Lloyd really is, especially after he became a conduit for the Source Dragons. That being said though, there are two issues that I have with Lloyd when it comes to Part 2. For one, Part 2 introduces quite possibly one of the worst retcons in all of Dragons Rising for Lloyd, because right before Lloyd's match against Zeatrix, Roby says that Lloyd is the elemental master of life, which... no. The franchise has been consistent on this thing for years, with calling Lloyd's elemental power energy. This has been said for over a decade at this point, with so many different forms of Ninjago media, including the show itself back during season 4, specifically during the episode Day of the Dragon, when Lloyd said that his elemental power was energy, as well as in the recently released Ninjago character encyclopedia, which came out last year, which referred to Lloyd as the elemental master of energy. Lloyd's elemental power is energy, not life. And in my opinion, this is quite possibly one of the worst retcons in all of Dragons Rising, because it doesn't make any sense at all, and it goes against over a decade's worth of previously established information when it comes to the show, and it just doesn't really make any sense at all, considering how consistent the franchise has been at calling Lloyd's elemental power energy. Why change it to life? That doesn't make any sense at all. And to be completely honest with you guys, I'm not going to be referring to Lloyd's elemental powers as life, and I'm going to keep on calling them energy. But also, there's the other big issue that I want to bring up when it comes to Lloyd, and it's that after the ninja learn about Roz manipulating Jay, and Nya says that she wants to go after Jay and find him, Lloyd tells her not to do that and to wait until after the tournament. And I understand that the tournament is important given that Roz and Noct are there, except this doesn't make any sense at all for Lloyd to do because of Season 11, where during that season, the ninja were in the exact same kind of position when they went to the Neverrealm and they thought that Zane was taken prisoner by the Ice Emperor, and Lloyd went on his own to the Ice Emperor's fortress in order to try and rescue Zane, and after Lloyd found out that Zane was the Ice Emperor, he did whatever he could in order to get Zane back to the way he was. So now in Dragons Rising, Lloyd sees that Nya is basically in the same position that he was in back during Season 11, and he tells her not to do anything and to wait until after the tournament? That doesn't make any sense at all, because again, Nya's in the exact same position that Lloyd was in back during Season 11. Again, I understand that the tournament is important here, but why is Lloyd telling Nya to wait until after the tournament? That doesn't make any sense at all for Lloyd to do. But with those two things being the exception, again, overall, I did honestly really like how Lloyd was handled during Part 2, again, except for those last two things. But now, it's time for me to get into my biggest overall problem when it comes to Part 2, and it's actually a tie between two things, with those two things being Eren and Jay. Honestly, I was not a fan of how either of these characters were handled during Part 2 at all. So let's begin by discussing Eren, where we get his corruption arc. This is something that Ninjago fans have been theorizing about for a while after we got the release of Part 1, and in my opinion, just like with most things when it comes to Dragons Rising, this is an idea that on paper sounded good, but in practice wasn't handled that well. On paper, I think this is an idea for Eren that could have worked. The idea of Eren essentially feeling inadequate in comparison to the rest of the ninja team, with him slowly becoming more and more disillusioned with them as time goes on, as a result of Eren getting hurt and betrayed by the other members of the ninja team, all while Roz manipulates him, ultimately resulting in Eren reaching a breaking point where he becomes fully disillusioned with the ninja team, he turns against them, and he decides to work alongside Roz. Again, on paper, I feel like this is something that could have worked, and I feel like this is an interesting direction to take Eren's character. The problem, though, is with the execution of it, because honestly, I feel like as a result of this story, it wasn't really handled that well, and I feel like when it came to Eren during Part 2, he honestly felt really self-centered, reckless, it felt like he wasn't making a lot of smart decisions, it felt like Eren was the one who was actually hurting and betraying the other members of the ninja team, not the other way around, and honestly, by the time Part 2 came to an end, in my opinion, Eren felt incredibly unlikable and hard to root for. Now, this can be seen with Eren being hurt and betrayed by two of the members of the team in particular, Sora and Lloyd, and in my opinion, neither of these really worked that well. For starters, there's Sora, and like I said earlier, the truth comes out that Sora was the one who spun the mech hand around, not Eren, and Eren ends up getting really mad at Sora for this. Which, to be fair, does make sense given the fact that Sora lied to him, so I can understand Eren being mad at her. However, I'd argue that Eren is also in the wrong, given the fact that he continuously remains mad at Sora, even though Sora does what she can to try and apologize to Eren and make up for it, and Sora very clearly feels bad about what happened, yet Eren continuously remains mad at her. And not only that though, but Eren refuses to see Sora sign the story, and the fact that when it comes to Sora, she literally had no choice but to use her powers, otherwise Nia was going to get sent through the portal and be stuck in Nether Space. Sora even pointed this out, that she had no choice, yet Eren still remains mad at her. Again, I understand that he's mad because Sora lied to him. However, again, he never sees Sora sign the story and instead only focuses on her lying and her using her powers and not why she did what she did. And when it comes to Sora and Eren, I feel like the two of them are both in the right and in the wrong in this situation, yet the show only ever portrays Sora as being the one in the wrong, even though arguably Eren is also in the wrong, and I'd argue even more in the wrong than Sora, considering him continuously remaining mad at Sora and his refusal to see her sign the story. And this, I feel, is one of the examples of Eren feeling self-centered, because again, he's really only focusing on himself and not Sora and her side of the story. And then we have the stuff with Lloyd, and this doesn't really make any sense at all. So for starters, the first big moment that we get of Eren being mad at Lloyd happens when Lloyd says that they're going to go and look for Jay after the tournament, and Eren ends up getting really mad at Lloyd because Lloyd said that they were going to go and look for his parents after the tournament, and now they're looking for Jay. But the thing is, it makes sense that the team would be prioritizing Jay over Eren's parents, given the fact that Jay lost his memories, Roz manipulated him into becoming a bad guy, and Jay was corrupted via the power of Shatterspin. And Eren is still getting mad at Lloyd, even though again, it makes perfect sense that the team would be prioritizing looking for Jay over his parents. And once again, this I feel is another moment of Eren being self-centered, because he's only focusing on the fact that the team is going to be looking for Jay instead of his parents, and not why the team would be looking for Jay instead of his parents. So there's that. Then after this, we have the big reveal that Wu was responsible for the merge starting in the first place, which, by the way, quick side tangent, this right here doesn't make any sense at all, because it's just a continuation of the bad characterization that we've been getting for Wu, essentially ever since Crystallize, with Crystallize in both seasons of Dragons Rising essentially going against and undoing Wu's Season 11 arc, which was specifically dedicated to Wu finally taking accountability for not telling the ninja about bad stuff that he knew was going to happen, yet Crystallize and so far both seasons of Dragons Rising have completely gone against that, with Wu being aware of certain things that he didn't tell the ninja about. And when it comes to Season 2, again, it's just continuing on with this bad characterization for Wu that we've been getting ever since Crystallize, which completely goes against the Season 11 arc. Okay, tangent over. And anyway, when it comes to Eren, he finds out that Wu was responsible for the merge starting, and he goes to tell Lloyd about it during the final match of the tournament when Sora is fighting against Noct, and when Lloyd, understandably, isn't able to instantly process the information that his uncle was responsible for the merge starting, Eren ends up getting really mad at Lloyd for this. Even when Zane points out how it's a lot of information to process, Eren still remains mad at Lloyd. And this is a moment in particular that I really didn't like, mainly because in this moment, Eren is being a really big hypocrite, because the show has made it pretty clear that Eren hasn't been able to fully process his own emotions surrounding his parents being lost during the merge, yet he's calling out Lloyd and getting mad at him for not being able to process his emotions, even though it's pretty clear that Eren also hasn't been able to process his own emotions. And just like when it came to the instance with Sora, the show doesn't portray Eren as being in the wrong for being like this, even though again, he's being a hypocrite towards Lloyd here. And then there's the final big moment of Eren getting mad at Lloyd, and that is during the final fight against Noct, when Eren is able to use a regular Spinjitzu Tornado after using Roz's training techniques, and Lloyd got really proud at Eren for doing this, but Eren ended up getting really mad at Lloyd, saying how he didn't learn Spinjitzu from him, and in this moment, we essentially get Eren blaming Lloyd for not being able to properly teach him how to use Spinjitzu, and the way the show frames it, it almost makes it look like Eren thinks Lloyd is a bad teacher and he had been holding him back, meanwhile with Roz that wasn't the case. And this, once again, doesn't make any sense at all, because for one, when it comes to Lloyd not being a good teacher, Eren was aware of that from the start. He always knew that Lloyd wasn't a good teacher and he wasn't as skilled or as wise as Sensei Wu was, and that Lloyd was trying to get better as time went on. Eren was aware of this, yet Eren's acting like Lloyd has always been this really wise and skilled master, which again was not true at all. And again, Eren was aware of this, yet he's still getting mad at Lloyd. And he's also giving all the credit to Roz and his training techniques for how he was able to unlock the power of Spinjitzu, but I'd argue that isn't really what's going on here, because when you take a look at the scene when Eren's first able to unlock the power of full Spinjitzu, this is one of the very few moments during part 2 where Eren is focusing on something other than his parents, which is something that he focuses on all throughout part 2, and as a result of Lloyd focusing on something other than his parents, he's finally able to unlock the power of Spinjitzu. And this isn't even the first time we've gotten something like this, because we saw something very similar during Season 1 with Eren being able to use Object Spinjitzu. So I'd argue that when it comes to Eren, he was the one who was holding himself back when it came to him learning Spinjitzu, because he's had this obsession with trying to find his parents, and that's what's been holding him back. So either A, he's getting mad at Lloyd for no reason, or B, he's essentially blaming Lloyd for his own shortcomings because he doesn't want to admit that he's been the one who's been holding himself back. And after this ends up happening, Eren decides to fully work alongside Roz and follow him, knowing full well that Roz is a bad guy, and essentially ignoring any red flags associated with working alongside Roz, even though Eren was pointing out those red flags earlier on during part 2. All on the off chance that Roz might know the location of where his parents are, something that Roz might not even know about at all. And overall, like I said, when it came to Eren during part 2, he honestly came off as feeling really self-centered and reckless during part 2. And something that I noticed is that when it comes to the show, it tries to make it look like the rest of the ninja were hurting and betraying Eren, which is why he ultimately turned to the dark side. But I'd argue that again, Eren was the one who was actually hurting and betraying the other members of the ninja team. I mean, after all, he's the one who remained mad at Sora and refused to see her side of the story. He's the one who decided to use Roz's training techniques after warning Frack about Roz being a bad guy. He's the one who decided to listen to Roz despite him being a bad guy and a manipulator. He's the one who got mad at Lloyd for prioritizing finding Jay over his parents. He's the one who got mad at Lloyd for not being able to process his emotions while Eren himself didn't process his own emotions. He's the one who got mad at Lloyd for being able to learn proper Spinjitzu. He's the one who decided to follow Roz while ignoring any red flags associated with working with him. Like, Eren was the one responsible for a lot of the bad stuff that happened to him, and I'd argue Eren was the one who was pushing the ninja team away from him, and it wasn't the other way around. Yet the show portrays the ninja as being the one in the wrong, and not Eren, when arguably he was the one who was actually doing a lot of the bad stuff. And again, I'd argue he was the one who was actually hurting and betraying the other members of the ninja team, not the other way around as the show tries to portray it. And so overall, when it came to Eren, like I said, I honestly really didn't like how he was handled during part 2, because while I think the idea for his corruption arc on paper was good, in practice, I don't think it was handled that well. And again, like I said, by the time part 2 came to an end, Eren, in my opinion, honestly felt really unlikable and hard to root for. And then finally, there's Jay, the other big issue that I had when it came to part 2, and just... I really did not like what part 2 did with Jay. At all. I know I said that when it comes to Jay and Eren, they were tied for being my overall biggest problem when it came to part 2. But if I had to pick one that I did dislike more than the other one, it would definitely have to be Jay. I really did not like what part 2 did with him. At all. Now, I'm not going to go super in-depth when it comes to the Jay stuff in this video, mainly because I'm going to be making an entirely separate video going over my issues with Jay, not just in part 2, but really Dragons Rising in general, so keep an eye out for that because it's going to be coming out shortly after this video. But for now, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the issues that I had when it came to Jay during part 2. For one, Jay's transformation into a villain happens completely off-screen, and we're only ever given a vague explanation as to what happened after the transformation happened, which in my opinion caused Jay's inclusion in the season, especially him as a villain, to feel incredibly forced and out of place, and it did not feel like a natural inclusion in the story. Secondly, as a result of said transformation, Jay's character and personality also ended up changing, and once again, this happened off-screen, and this is something else that honestly felt incredibly forced, because when it came to Jay, he didn't even feel like the same character during part 2. And once again, this did not feel natural at all. Jay initially went from being a really nice and kind person who cared about others, who got easily scared but was still willing to step it up and be serious and brave when the time called for it, and as someone who also tried to make people laugh, to becoming an overly serious, arrogant, unlikable jerk who doesn't care about anyone or anything. And again, this did not feel like a natural transformation for Jay's character at all as a result of this happening off screen. Also, I feel like as a result of this really forced off-screen transformation, I feel like this results in a lot of Jay's dialogue during part 2 feeling incredibly empty and holding nowhere near as much weight as the show wanted to. Also, after Jay's one fight against Nia, the show essentially gets rid of him almost as soon as he shows up, which basically continues on with a major issue for Jay and Dragon's Rising in general, where each chapter will build up to Jay's return, only for him to get like one scene where barely anything about him is explained, and the show then gets rid of him almost as soon as he shows up, meaning that the show is going to be dragging this evil Jay story out until season 3, which is something that honestly I really don't like. There's also the rest of the ninja who seemingly don't really care that much about Jay becoming a bad guy and him being corrupted by the power of Shatterspin. Nia is literally the only one who shows any legitimate concern over Jay. Meanwhile, the rest of the team either does not care, Cole and Kai make jokes about the situation, and Aaron only cares that Jay might know the location of his parents. And in my opinion, I think it's really weird that Nia is the only one who shows any concern for Jay, meanwhile the rest of the team just doesn't. And then there's my biggest overall problem with Jay, and it was the big thing that I talked about during my video discussing the stuff that I was and wasn't looking forward to when it came to Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, and it is that the evil Jay story is just a repeat of the Ice Emperor story, with just about every storyline and plot point from the original story being repeated here in some way or another, with the only real difference being that Jay does not regain his memories and become a good guy again at the end of part 2, but that's probably going to happen at some point during season 3. And so overall, when it comes to Jay, I really did not like how he was handled during part 2 at all. I had so many major issues with him, and I officially take back what I said about Jay being at his worst during season 1 of Dragon's Rising. Instead, I'd say that Jay is at his worst during season 2 of Dragon's Rising, because in my opinion, the stuff that we got with Jay during part 2 was bad, and I'd argue it is some of the worst stuff, not just with Jay, but I'd argue that this is some of the worst stuff that we've gotten when it comes to Ninjago. I really did not like what part 2 did with Jay at all. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. Overall, when it came to part 2 of season 2 of Dragon's Rising, like I said at the beginning of the video, personally, part 2 honestly felt pretty underwhelming in my opinion. And not only that, I'd even go so far as to say that part 2 of season 2 of Dragon's Rising was just bad, honestly. Which is something that I can't really say about any other chapter of Dragon's Rising. I may have my issues with parts 1 and 2 of season 2, but I wouldn't say that either of them were flat out bad or anything. And as I've said in the past, I honestly think that part 1 of season 2 was good, and I legitimately enjoyed it. But when it comes to part 2, again, personally, I just thought it was honestly bad. I had numerous major issues with part 2 in some way or another. Stuff like the tournament not being handled that well. I feel like a bunch of the ninja, especially Aaron and Jay, weren't handled that well. There were numerous writing problems that I had, like a ton of stuff happening off screen and a bunch of things getting set up but ultimately no payoff. A bunch of the characters I feel weren't really handled that well. And overall, I just didn't really think part 2 was all that good. There were definitely some aspects about part 2 that I did enjoy, like some of the ninja and some of the villains, but even then, for some of the stuff that I did like, I still had some problems with how they were handled, and so overall when it comes to part 2, again, I just didn't really think it was very good overall. Now, taking both parts 1 and 2 of season 2 into account, what exactly would I rank this season? Well, when it comes to part 1 of season 2, like I said, I did think it was honestly good, and for part 1, I'd honestly give it a 6 out of 10. I think it was honestly pretty solid, all things considered. It wasn't great or amazing or anything, but I did think that it was good in a number of different ways, and definitely an improvement compared to season 1 of Dragon's Rising. But when it comes to part 2, I honestly didn't really think it was that good overall. And if I had to give part 2 a score out of 10, I would honestly end up giving this a 3.5 out of 10. I really didn't think it was that good. And combined, I would honestly give season 2 of Dragon's Rising overall a score of 5 out of 10, to be completely honest with you guys. It's not outright terrible or anything, and I feel like part 1 does do a lot of really great things, but part 2 I feel overall really holds this season back. I think that Season 2 overall is a bit better than Season 1, but it still isn't anything that great, all things considered. And ranking this alongside the other Ninjago seasons, I would honestly end up putting Season 2 overall in the number 14 spot on my list. Right above Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, but right below the Fire chapter. Overall, when it comes to part 2 of Season 2, again, personally, I just didn't really think it was that good, and I feel like it honestly really holds back Season 2 overall, even though there are aspects of it that I do think are good. Now, I know that a lot of you guys are probably gonna end up disagreeing with me, considering I know that a lot of people do really like Part 2, and I have definitely seen the comments when it comes to my videos discussing Dragon's Rising, and if you do disagree with me, that's perfectly fine. We're all entitled to our own opinions and takes when it comes to Ninjago. And again, if you liked Part 2, that's perfectly fine, and I'm glad that you were able to find enjoyment in something that I personally didn't. But overall, when it comes to Part 2, again, for me, honestly, I didn't really think it was that good. And overall, when it came to Part 2, I just thought that it was pretty underwhelming. Here's hoping that Season 3 will be an improvement, and I'm really hoping that it is, especially given the rumors that Season 3 is going to have some stuff to do with Zane, and given that he's my favorite ninja, I am really looking forward to that. But we're just going to have to wait and see. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me, what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to Part 2 of Season 2 of Dragon's Rising? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.